Last round, any bar, USA. Old defunct USFL of the 1980s had a lot of innovation, investors, a lot of
star players, a lot of color phones, and a lot of competitive games each week. But it didn't
have a lot of
success.
Hey everyone, Will O'Toole welcome you to another edition of Park Ridge Sports History. I figured I would travel down as spring is coming closer and closer. We are now, as I'm going to tape here, and I apologize of my voice. I have been really battling laryngitis and a cough over the last couple of weeks, and seems to be getting better. And then all of a sudden, boom, you just have an explosion of just coughing, and the laryngitis comes up. So I'm going to plow through this, and I hope you're patient and understanding of my voice at this point. But as spring is approaching, you know, there's another new league, that football league, that, of course, is a spinoff of the NFL, United Football League, which plays in the spring, very reminiscent of a league way back in the 80s, 40 years ago. Can't believe this. The United States Football League, which, as my opening cartoon stated, had many good players, had some very good coaches, and as you're going to find out, had some innovations that are today a staple in the NFL. And of course, they had some celebrated owners, aka Donald Trump. They had some really competitive games. I do recall watching some of the playoff games, especially the first two championship games, and they were pretty good. In fact, they were better in terms of competitiveness, better than the early NFL Super Bowls. And when you think about it, up until about 83 or 85, there weren't that many good Super Bowls. It was usually dominated by one team or the other. The only one I can think of in a lot of ways, and I have to go back, and I'm watching this now in terms of nostalgia, but the Jet game was riveting in this point. It was, at the time of the game, kind of boring because the Jets just churned out yardage in that whole fourth quarter and the whole second half. They took a 7-0 lead in that Super Bowl. They just churned out yardage. Joe was on. It's still, to me, the greatest quarterbacking of any great Hall of Famer in the history of the Super Bowl, simply because he just dissected the Baltimore defense, and they had no answer to any. And basically, all he was doing was running the ball, counters, draws, etc. Then, of course, you do have some competitive games in the late 80s, but up until that time, the USFL was conducting some very good football in the spring, and the championship games played in late July. They weren't bad. The problem is, of course, they were running against baseball at the time, which had really seen a resurrection, almost like the Phoenix coming out of the ashes because of the 75 series, and little things added up to that. And of course, the reemergence of the Yankees as a dominant team in the American League all help the popularity of baseball in the 70s and the 80s. But I just want to take a look at that 1980s USFL league. As you know, people don't realize this, maybe. They started off and they were going to compete as a spring league with teams in places that hadn't been in the NFL in a while. I'm going to give you some of the names. Obviously, they were going to have a team in New York, but they were going to play in the Meadowlands. The New Jersey Generals, kind of a name I liked, and they immediately went out and got Herschel Walker, who had won the Heisman and then skipped his senior year to join the USFL. They had also gotten, well, the league I'm talking about, had gotten Mike Rozier, also had signed the Heisman Trophy winner, Doug Flutie from 1984. He joined with the New Jersey Generals, and then the Generals probably, you could say, really did one-up that by signing Jim Kelly, I think, but he had also played for the Houston Gamblers. But just take a look at some of the teams as I reminisce here. It was pretty interesting, and as I'm going to reminisce, you have Boston Breakers had a pretty good football helmet, and I'm just talking about with the little waves. They eventually moved from Boston and go down to New Orleans. But I always thought that was a pretty good nickname for a league that had some pretty good ones and some lousy ones. You had the Washington, D.C. The only unique thing was that they were green, and usually, to me, that was a unique color in my mind for Washington teams, because usually there's some sort of red in their colors, suggesting the government. And you had a team, the Birmingham Stallions. You had the Houston Gamblers, which I thought was pretty cool. They had a great logo with a bandit. It was all in black and on a black helmet with just a white outline. You had another team, the Michigan Panthers, but they do win the first championship. You have the Denver Gold, but they had a pretty cool logo. It was a black helmet with a gold nugget shaped almost like the sun, but it does look like a nugget with all the glistening from it. And they were actually coached by Craig Morton, who I always thought was a pretty good coach. And I don't know why he didn't get an NFL job. And then you had one of my favorite teams, the Jacksonville Bulls. They played in the Gator Bowl. They did play before throngs of fans. Probably were more popular than the present Jacksonville team in many respects. And another team in Florida, you had the Orlando Renegades. I think Lou Corzo might have been the coach there for a bit. And the Tampa Bay Bandits. And they had a really colorful owner. They were exciting. And, of course, they had Steve Spurrier as their coach there for a while. And he ran basically an exciting offense. In fact, Jim Kelly, when he was with the Houston Gamblers, they ran a run and shoot. And I think maybe Mouse Davis was one of the coaches down there, and he was legendary for his offense. Then you had the LA Express. But LA Express had Steve Young, who would go on to win a Super Bowl with the 49ers. So you had a host of really good teams, some cool nicknames, some terrible ones. One of the teams that had probably the ugliest, and it was I got to be honest with you, it was too cartoonish, and I'm going to show it to you, is the Oakland Invaders. Of course, it was a play off the Oakland Raiders, but they had a fist holding a lightning bolt with an ugly yellow and blue. I don't know about it. I was never crazy about it. Oh, and a team that had Reggie White, kind of cool, the Steamboats of Memphis. The Memphis Steamboats had a pretty cool helmet, had the Steamboat wheel as its official logo on the helmet. It was pretty cool. So they had some nice logos. What I didn't realize was that the beginnings of this USFL team was born as an idea of a New Orleans entrepreneur businessman by the name of David Dixon, way back in the 60s. Now, I was doing the research on this. The funny thing is, I did use Wikipedia as my research. They actually made a couple of mistakes statistically with some of the NFL references that they make. So as I've told you before, I think everybody uses Wikipedia as a first reference, but I do sometimes check it. In this case, they made a couple of mistakes. I feel glaring mistakes on the football side of the David Dixon story. But anyway, David Dixon was a New Orleans entrepreneur, was the catalyst behind the New Orleans Saints becoming an NFL team back in 1967, because as early as the 1962, he had petitioned the NFL for a team. Of course, they turned him down. So he decides, all right, what can I do? So he opens up to the AFL, and he asks them or pursues them to host their AFL All-Star game, which they do. Problem was, the African-American players who were invited had some problems in the French Quarter. So the AFL, all right, under the support of all the players, leave New Orleans for the All-Star game. And they go, and Houston becomes the host. And, of course, Houston had the Texans, which later on become the Kansas City Chiefs. But Dixon wasn't done or thwarted. He gets a group of investors. And, in fact, ready for this, and this is where I looked. Dixon was willing to pay the Oakland Raiders $236,000 after a 1-13 season in 1961. Well, there were actually 2-12, that Oakland Raider team. And they didn't have one coach that year. they had 2, which didn't last. Let me just run this by. So Wikipedia has, and listen, everything makes mistakes and all the rest of it, but you should always, as they say, verify, trust but verify routine, and always go to a second and sometimes third source. In 1962, they were 1-13. In 1961, when he originally saw this, they were 2-12. So maybe they got the year or the date wrong. But the next season, they were 1-13. They actually had 2 coaches that year. Marty Feldman, who would never coach again after the Oakland. He was 0-5. And then Bill Contright would finish out the season getting their lone win for the Oakland Raiders. And he was 1-8. Interestingly enough, those Oakland Raider teams are horrible the first few years. Their only win comes on the last day of the year. In 1962, they beat the Boston Patriots to finish 1-13. But remember, they said that this was 1961. The year I'm talking about is 62. So a little bit of an error. Maybe a typo, who knows. But what it does, what I actually appreciate was the fact that I had to investigate this a little more. It wasn't until, so they fire Concrite and they hire Al Davis as their coach. He immediately goes 10-4 in 1963. Oakland decides to stay in Oakland, probably because the Oakland mayor at the time, John Houlihan, interceded and he secured a group of investors to keep Oakland in Oakland. And really, when you think about it, had Houlihan not done that, he would have, the Raiders probably would have left and they would have been the Oakland Raiders, now the New Orleans Raiders. And then you say, all right, New Orleans has a team. Now the Saints don't emerge. And here's the interesting thing I found out. I'm just going to put this up here, my little notes that I was getting. They get rid of players. They get rid of coaches. Al Davis has a good first year, but he kind of struggles. And it's not until they hire John Rourke, who turns Oakland, I would say, into a perennial winner, because it was John Rourke who would later, I remember him as a coach at Stanford with Jim Plunkett. He would go on to coach Stanford to back-to-back Rose Bowls, but he coached the Oakland Raiders and changed their whole offense. They started off, they were 6th in the league in offense in his first year, but they were still 8-5-1. Their defense, of course, was 5 out of 9, 5th in the league. But they go 13-1 in his second year. They go to the Super Bowl. They're first in offense. They scored 468 points, basically over 25 points a game. And they were second in defense. And then the third year, they fall to 12-2, don't make the Super Bowl, but they still remain first in offense with 453 points. So there were a couple of things emerged for the Oakland Raiders. Perhaps, again, here's the effect of the USFL and maybe guys wanting to be part of the NFL and all the rest of it, is that him stirring the pot, Dixon from New Orleans, forces the Oakland Raiders to do some really make some moves in the front office and on the football field itself. They get a new coach. The coach is Al Davis. Al Davis eventually is kicked upstairs. They hire John Rourke, who secures them their first Super Bowl appearance in the 68 one against the Packers, and they lose 33-14. But everything is set. But Dixon pushing for all this, the NFL knew that maybe the next move would be for New Orleans to get an expansion team in the AFL. And so they were offered after Atlanta comes into the league in 1966. And it's interesting because everyone thinks this bye week is something new. And it really has a history in the NFL. And 1966, for instance, the Atlanta Falcons make it uneven. The number of teams uneven in the league. So everybody had a bye week somewhere along the line. And I think that year the Atlanta Falcons have the bye week the last week in the season. All right. They finally win a game. They beat the Giants, I believe, as their first official franchise win. And then the next year, John Gilliam really unbelievably unveils the New Orleans Saints by running back the opening kickoff on opening day against the LA Rams. And that was really the highlight of the season for the New Orleans Saints. But John Gilliam, Dave Dixon, Dave Dixon, they secure New Orleans as a NFL football franchise. Now, what I find interesting with the whole thing with Dixon is that he wanted to play in the spring, and he does force the NFL to bring in his NFL Saints. Here's the deal, though. He was good friends with Lamar Hunt. And when I was reading his biography, I'm saying to myself, why doesn't he ask Lamar Hunt to join the AFL with a franchise? He easily could have moved in there. And now you might have had the, let's say, New Orleans Saints of the AFL. The only thing I can think of is that, and I'm going to read it right here. In 1967, he and good friend Lamar Hunt financed not a football league and not a football team, but they decide to go into the World Championship of Tennis. And as I state, if he's friends with Lamar Hunt, why didn't he ever join the AFL? That would be definitely a question. I would love to ask Lamar Hunt, the AFL, the lords of the AFL, and of course Dixon. It would have been pretty interesting. And it might have been, could have been as simple as, it never dawned on them. I doubt that. It could have been, maybe they just didn't want to be those kinds of partners. But that kind of falls through when you think of, well, they partner up on the World Championship of Tennis. I actually think maybe he was trying to force the hand to get maybe the AFL merged with the NFL. Who knows? Maybe with a class action lawsuit. Or I don't know, not a monopoly, but force Congress to talk about this and allow the AFL to merge, or give them as much movement, as much freedom as the NFL and maybe Major League Baseball has today. But it's interesting. I was floored when I saw that. But just taking a look at the USFL, interestingly enough, when I was looking through the USFL, first of all, their first winner was, of course, the Michigan Panthers. They had a guy by the name of Anthony Carter, and they had teams in Birmingham, the Stallions, the New Jersey Generals, the Showboats, the Baltimore Stars, who had moved from Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Stars. But there was a franchise called, and I think it might have been in another league, in the 70s, called the Philadelphia Bell. Interesting. I don't know. Just fun. We just used to make up names of teams and say, and we did some logical things, kind of like the Baltimore Ravens, named after maybe in homage to Edgar Allan Poe and all the rest of it. But that's what we used to do as kids too. When you're flipping cards, you're talking sports and all the rest of it. It was a lot of fun. We had some great, my brothers came up with some great nicknames for teams that I wish they used today, because they're certainly better than some of these names of teams, especially the group nouns that they use for some of the teams, like the Liberty of New York in basketball. All right. Cool name, the Orlando Renegades. They had a tomahawk as a helmet, as a logo. The Arizona Outlaws had a pretty good logo too. They were a team I kind of rooted for only because of their helmet. The San Antonio Gunslingers, the LA Express, and the Portland Breakers. I apologize. When you look at the thing, it's the San Antonio Gunslingers that have that cool bandit. The Gamblers had an interesting one. It was a G, and the cutout in the G was in the shape of the state of Texas, which I always thought is cool. It's almost like the Baskin-Robbins when you can see the 31, or the FedEx when you can see the little arrow and stuff. I love that little subtle stuff that they put in simple logos, which are hard to do. If you think creating a logo is easy, it's not. It's got to be simple, but as I say, it's got to be detailed as well. But some of the players in the league, as my cartoon indicated, I mean, They had Herschel Walker, Mike Rozier. They had Doug Flutie. They had back-to-back Heisman Trophy winners going to the NFL. Now, I'm not saying any of their careers became Hall of Famers. Herschel Walker, of course, spent many years in the NFL. Mostly his yardage is, and I hate the term, but I'm going to use it here because I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. He was a compiler with his yardage. Flutie, one of my favorite, if not my favorite college player of all time, he really built the Boston College Eagles, but he played a couple of years until the league folded in '86. What happened was they win the court case, Donald Trump forcing that court case. They actually beat the NFL. But unfortunately, and this has always kind of bothered me, they beat the NFL. But I don't really think their winning was ever taken seriously because if you remember, the jury only gave them three singles, $3, when they were looking for billions in payment. You know, they sued the NFL, and they won, but they lost, and they lost bigly because they lost not only just did they lose the money that they thought they were going to get. Oh, antitrust. That's what it was. Yeah, they were fighting, let's say, the antitrust. But they lost their league because, and I kind of like this, what Trump had envisioned was start later in the year. He actually wanted to merge with the CFL and start later in the spring and go into the beginning of fall and have maybe some of those Canadian football leagues merge with the United States Football League, and then they would become not only a formidable league, but an international league with two countries being involved in it. But some of the innovations, you know, they laughed at the USFL. And I guess that's where I'm coming from with this. You know, they laugh at, let's say, the upstart leagues. They don't laugh at them, though, when they're stealing their players or some coaches come over. And like Jack Pardee, NFL coach for the Washington Redskins, he jumped to the USFL, had some success in the USFL. There have been other guys who, give you a perfect example, who went from the USFL and then got into the NFL as a coach. Maybe not successful, but they paid their dues in the USFL and they were good enough that the NFL said, ooh, you know what, we can hire them. But I didn't realize this. The USFL really was the innovator for, was it a catch or was it an incompletion? So they went to cameras. They also did it with the fumbles. That was one of the innovations that they had in terms of using camera works to determine whether it was a catch or not. And now you have it all the time in every game, basically. You have, was it a fumble or a no fumble situation? Whether a pass was complete, incomplete, or intercepted, and when the ball penetrated the goal line. How many times do we now see, I think it's on almost every touchdown in the NFL and in college, the touchdown is definitely reviewed and reviewed and reviewed. And I'm not saying that the camera is perfect, but it is unbelievable how that the NFL adopted one of the rules that they were innovating in the USFL. Just to give you an idea, though, just for some fun, the last winner of the league, all right, in the playoffs, here's how they had it. They had a quarterfinals. Birmingham beat Houston 22-20. Baltimore beat New Jersey 2017. Tampa Bay lost to Oakland 30-27. Memphis throttled Denver 48-7. This is what I mean. You had 3 of the 4 games. That's not bad. You try that with the wild card. For the most part, the wild card games have been terrible or were terrible this year. You had 3 games decided by a field goal or fewer points. All right. In fact, 22-20, 20-17. You knew it came down right to the last play or so. Then, all right, spread out a little bit more. Baltimore beat Birmingham 28-14. Oakland beat Memphis 28-19. But in the championship, Baltimore beat Oakland in the final USFL 28-24. Pretty interesting. I just loved the fact that the USFL tried to do some things that were obviously radical. They did play an 18-game season, if I recall. Yeah, 18 games. And here's the NFL flirting with the idea of going to 18. Right now they're playing 17. And I've said on this show before, all the NFL has to do, if they want to get to President's Day, as the theory is, so that you can have the next day off and it's not a national or a federal holiday, all they have to do is have each month just have a bye week for every team. And just do it, just coordinate it so that there's always NFL games going on, but just fewer. And those 4 games, now they get, I think, maybe 2. But those extra 2 weeks brings you right to President's Weekend. And if they added, let's say, another layer of playoffs, you could really, really put a foundation in for President's Weekend as the Super Bowl weekend. Of course, they probably don't want to step on the toes of the NBA, but right now, the NBA is floundering with their All-Star. Nobody wants to watch it because it's not fun. Certainly not as riveting as the NHL All-Star exhibition that they put on with the different nations playing, basically a mini Olympics. It was pretty exciting. And anybody who watched that Canada-United States series, those 2 games, were locked into just a tense, stress, pressure, exciting, just heart-pounding games. They were, I tell you, hockey did itself a huge favor by playing these types of games. And I thought maybe what the NBA should do is go to have the NBA and the Women's League play a mixed all-star game. Why not? Can't play the women. I mean, that would be just... But if you mixed Caitlin Clark with Stephen Curry, right, on one team, you might make for an exciting weekend for the NBA that Sunday. Now, if the NFL, courtesy of the USFL, decided to move to President's Day, NBA could certainly move there. They could actually move their All-Star game, just move it up a month and play it on Martin Luther King weekend. That would be interesting. And that really wouldn't hurt, per se, the NFL, because you could play the playoff games on a Friday night and a Saturday and give the NBA the Sunday. Or have a couple of football games early in the morning and have the NBA All-Star game in the afternoon, or the NBA All-Star game lead up to the NFL. So there's possibilities there, okay? I just thought, though, I was stunned when I saw that the USFL really didn't have its beginnings in the early 80s. It really goes back, as I said, back to the 60s, and really one man's attempt, and he was successful, of getting New Orleans a franchise. All right, second and last point and cartoon I want to make. The Yankees. And of course, this is a cartoon in its beginnings. I figured I'd show you where I am. But the Yankees are now allowing facial hair and not just mustaches anymore for their players. I guess they're getting with the program. Although I still like the story that is told by Lou Piniella when Lou tried to come into spring training with longer hair that went down to his shoulders, and George Steinbrenner came over to him and said, "Lou, you got to cut your locks. I don't allow the hair to be that long." He says, basically, the story goes they went back and forth, and George Steinbrenner said, or worse to this effect, or how the story goes, that, all the great people in America in history had short hair or something like that. And Lou turned around and said, "Well, what about Jesus?" He had long hair. And George came back just as fast, supposedly, and said to Lou, "Well, when you can pull off miracles every day, you can wear your hair long," or words to that effect. And of course, Lou was beaten and promptly went and got his hair cut. Then Steinbrenner allowed mustaches. And I just recall probably one of the first guys to come over, and this is about 74. Hunter, as you recall, was part of the swinging A's team, and they all grew their hair long, beards, sideburns, mustaches, goatees, the whole thing. And Finley paid them for that. And as I had mentioned in a past show, it was kind of funny. It was unique. And then I started doing some investigating, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. And of course, as soon as I say I'm pretty sure I'm right, I'm probably going to be wrong. But I do recall the first two players on a Topps baseball card after the ban is lifted on facial hair to wear facial hair, mustaches, on their faces for a baseball card picture were Richie Allen, or Dick Allen, and Reggie Jackson. And what I find interesting about that is that Reggie, like Hunter, would later join the Yankees, and he would have a mustache. But when he was playing for the A's, he did wear a beard, a full beard, and of course he comes over with George Steinbrenner's team, the Yankees, and cuts the beard but keeps the mustache, much like Catfish Hunter. But I thought the Richie Allen one, and I looked. Now, I had his 1970 baseball card. I never had his 71 baseball card. All right. But that was when he was with the Dodgers. And Topps does have a baseball card, has it with Allen with facial hair. But I don't believe Allen was ever fined, because I believe the picture was taken during spring training. And I don't think the Dodgers fined him for wearing facial hair. But you can see where the game has changed and how things are actually returning, because the all-time players, if you look at the 1870s and the 1880s and 1890s, all those guys were wearing facial hair. I mean, Raleigh Fingers, what I loved about him, I would never do it, but he had that handlebar mustache. And that was reminiscent of the early the early baseball teams in the National League and the American League from the 1860s all the way up to the 1900s. And of course, the American League, 1901. Wearing them all the way. I think they probably stopped in the maybe about the early 1920s. And of course, I didn't think about this, and now I do. Maybe I'll have to look it up. The last player to appear on a card with a beard before there was a ban on facial hair. Because if you take a look at all the 1950s players, none of them. 1960s players, none of them have facial hair on their baseball cards, wearing any kind of facial hair as they pose for their baseball cards. So it's kind of fascinating how the game changes and then goes back. Everything is cyclical. And for George and the Yankees, the beard is back. We'll wonder if the Yankees are as well. Hey, this is Will O'Toole who brought you the USFL beginnings and the beginnings of the New York Yankees hair era. Thanks for joining us. Bye now.